Hey friends, there's a lot of warframes, like a whole bunch of them. Some of them are even pretty good, while others are just kinda also there. But today I'd like to argue that out of all of them, the worst warframe is actually Rhino. I don't mean that Rhino is the weakest warframe, and I don't mean that he's the least useful warframe. I don't even mean he's my least favorite warframe. What I mean is that I think Rhino embodies some of the worst design choices in Warframe, that those choices lead to the most boring gameplay experiences available in the game, and even that his very existence might be harmful to the community. And I'm here to prove it. Or at least to open a discussion and then get yelled at. Either way. Now, I do like how Rhino looks. His design is pretty cool, the iron skin effect looks great, especially on Prime, and I think there's potential in having a frame based on like a Juggernaut kind of guy. But my issues are rooted in the design of his powers, so let me start with a quick rundown of everything that isn't a problem. His passive is just heavy impact, like the mod, so if you fall far enough you get this shockwave when you land that does a little damage. It's pretty useless, but that's most of the passives on older frames, so it's not the biggest deal. Moving on to his first ability, Rhino Charge is a simple horizontal dash. It damages enemies it passes through and can be chained together for higher damage and lower cost. It has synergies with both Iron Skin and Stomp, and also its augment gives you some extra armor for hitting enemies. Overall, it's a little janky for a movement power since it can't move vertically at all, but other than that, it's fine. Skipping ahead a little to his fourth ability, Rhino Stomp damages all the enemies in a radius around you, and then puts them in like a stasis for a while. Its augment refills Iron Skin, but other than that, there isn't really a lot else to say about Stomp. I think it's pretty cool. I like any power that cheats at interception. So now, all that's left are Iron Skin and Roar, easily the two strongest and most iconic powers Rhino has. And while they are strong and iconic, unfortunately, they're also both really stupid. From a purely high-level mechanical design perspective, Iron Skin and Roar are some of the dumbest abilities in the game. Hear me out on this. Starting with Iron Skin, it gives Overguard, which is basically a second health bar that makes you invulnerable and status immune until it runs out. In Rhino's case, the Overguard's health initially scales to his armor, but it also absorbs all incoming damage for a few seconds, and then adds that amount to its total health. Also, its augment does some damage or something. But here's the thing, right? Most of the defensive tank-style abilities in the game either don't block everything, only give damage resistance, or come with heavy downsides. But with Iron Skin, for the low price of occasionally pressing 2, you might as well turn off damage completely for low and mid-level missions. And look, I get it. A ton of things are overpowered in the early game and then fall off later, and while Rhino is viable at those higher levels, it's not like Iron Skin keeps that OP status. But keep in mind who makes up a lot of the Rhino users. New players. People who might only have access to those low-level missions where Iron Skin becomes God mode. And like in any other game, playing with cheats can be fun for a little while, but not having any conflict at all will just drain the fun out of it. Now, I've spent an amount of time playing this game, and like a lot of older players, I've probably put more time and effort helping people navigate the early game than D has spent designing it. But I've also seen a lot of those people drop Warframe for a lot of reasons. Sometimes the amount of stuff to do is overwhelming or difficult to understand, but other times they just feel like it's too grindy or they get bored. A lot of time has been spent already talking about the new player experience, but people normally focus on very surface-level design decisions, like poor in-game explanations and how they can make people feel lost. But there are also subtler, more complex problems, like for instance, I don't think we, as a community, really consider the consequences of telling newbies to farm Rhino. Imagine this. You're brand new to Warframe. You've spent several hours in the game already, and you feel like you pretty much understand your starter gear. Maybe you even have a few things building in your foundry. But now you're having a lot of trouble with the next junction. So, you search for some advice and find one thing repeated everywhere you look. Build Rhino. You already fought Jackal once, so you head to Venus to get the rest of the parts. Farming for Rhino used to go roughly like this. But in 2020, the Jackal fight was reworked, and while the newer one is better, it's also a lot more tedious while you're grinding, and you have to do it 6 or 7 times to get all the parts. And that may not sound like a lot to you, a person with probably hundreds of hours logged, but keep in mind, we're talking about people who are so new to the game that they still get around everywhere by running there. This would be one of your first experiences with Warframe, and you aren't doing it because it's fun or because you like Rhino. You don't even really know what Rhino's like yet. This is just what you're told new players should do. But then after you finally get all the parts and farm all the resources and wait 3 days, the reward is now the game has no threat until you quadruple your playtime. Obviously, not everybody goes through that, but it isn't unheard of either. Some people won't even mind him, but others will just be funneled towards some of those common reasons to quit the game. All because of the design of Ironskin, Rhino's placement on Venus, and the idea that he should be everyone's second Warframe. And still, that's only half the issue, because while Ironskin makes gameplay boring for new players, Roar makes it boring for everyone. Roar gives Rhino, and allies in range, a flat damage buff for a while. For some reason, that buff is considered faction damage, but that's the whole power. It has no synergies, it has no nuance, it isn't interesting at all. It is just hit a button, number get bigger. Now yes, a ton of other frames have damage buffs in some capacity, but most of them have some kind of special mechanic or activation requirement, and all of them only affect weapon damage, with a lot of them being even more specific than that. The closest comparison is probably Mirage's Eclipse, which is also pretty much just hit a button for a free damage buff, but only because DE changed it from a much more interesting mechanic that involved light levels, but was way too janky. I'm not a huge fan of that either, but at least it still only affects weapons. But not only does Roar not have any kind of interesting mechanic, and not only does it alone buff all damage, but that thing about it being faction damage? Faction damage buffs are flat out better than normal ones, because of the way they're calculated. But normally they're balanced by only applying to a specific faction. Here's every source of faction damage buffs in the game. Look at it, it even looks stupid on the chart. Now I get it though, Rhino's one of the original frames, and it's not that strange for older mechanics in a long-lived game to be weird or super generic or overpowered. It does happen. But Warframe reworks abilities all the time, and DE clearly cares about keeping older frames in line with their modern design, because out of those original frames, almost all of them have had mechanical changes even in just the past few years. It doesn't always work, but the thought is there. But in the 80% of the game's life since 2015, Rhino has gotten 2 real changes that weren't just bug fixes or number tweaks. One made Ironskin give Overguard, which it pretty much did already, just not by name, and the other made Stomp castable in the air, a minor change to an ability that was already fine. So now, I've spent a lot of time here complaining and not a whole lot offering solutions, so let's look at Nezha real quick. It's no secret that Nezha's current post-Pablo kit resembles Rhino's a lot, but it's worth noting that he doesn't share either of the major problems I've listed with Rhino. His defensive power has damage resistance instead of Overguard, and while it is pretty tanky for how early on you can obtain him, you don't really see anyone telling new players that they have to build Nezha. And on the other hand, his damage power deals vulnerability to enemies instead of giving a buff to allies, which means you actually have to interact with the power in order to use it. And also it has synergies with both Firewalker and Divine Spear. Design-wise, this is a great power set. I think Nezha proves that you can keep the general idea of what Rhino's kit is going for, but then what would a hypothetical rework even look like? I've actually seen a shocking number of suggestions on this, but personally, I think it would be cool to replace Roar entirely with a kind of stand-your-ground type skill. Like, you'd channel it, and it would make Rhino a lot slower while it's on, but also continuously give the buff to everyone in range. That way, it's a little more situational, but also charge can be a little more useful for movement. And also, since all of his other augments loop back into armor and iron skin, maybe this one could make everybody in the buff's range share the overguard, so iron skin takes damage for all of them. That could be cool. Especially if it gives them the metal texture. Iron skin, on the other hand, could probably stay the same, but at least move Rhino off Venus, like swap him in Oberon or something. Now, we all know a rework like that isn't likely to ever happen, but really that brings up a whole other issue, because while I do think that these things are poor choices for game design, those bad choices are also incredibly comfortable for the players. It's very convenient to hit a button and deal extra damage with no other consideration, and it's very convenient to not take any damage when maybe you were struggling before. And a lot of times, people like convenience more than they like fun. But that means that, since the only solutions to the problems I've been trying to highlight all involve making Rhino less convenient, those solutions would be called nerfs, even if the powers got stronger. And people hate nerfs. Like, do you remember when they first announced that Roar wouldn't be at full power in Helminth? The comments on that forum post are just pages and pages of the saltiest people talking about this great betrayal. Just imagine if DE said they wanted to completely replace Roar. So no, I don't think a Rhino rework is going to happen, and especially not one that'll address any of what I've said. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter that much. Don't get me wrong, I stand by everything I've said here, but Rhino is far from the biggest problem Warframe has, and he's not even the biggest problem new players face. But that wasn't my point either. The point is that, I think, Rhino's issues offer a lot to talk about. Like, maybe there's more to discuss about the new player experience than just the obvious stuff. Or maybe it wouldn't be the biggest deal if reworks weren't reserved for Warframes that are underused and underpowered. And maybe even if a change feels like a nerf at first, it could make the game a lot better in the long run. That could be cool. Rhino still sucks though. Stay nice, friends.